Thank you again. And this time I'm muted. And thank you for the ODI to help set up this panel. Certainly a topic of great interest. I don't think we can avoid the news this week without looking at COP26 and without looking at the emergency we have around climate change. So we've assembled a panel that I hope will be able to make a good contribution to this discussion and get some questions from the audience to reflect on what people in the summit think about this topic. I'm Volker Buscher, I'm the Chief Data Officer at Arup. The reason we are so interested in that is we believe the global model is now set. 1.5 degrees is what we are aiming for. The data behind it, the science that has got us to this point is sound, and government and business and society at large is getting behind that goal. But what happens below? What happens in property and transport, in energy, in utilities, and cities, and agriculture? How can we use data for meaningful actions? How can we use data to achieve net zero in the timescales in front of us? And is there also an opportunity for growth, transparency, and inclusion in the way we could apply data to this grand challenge that we all face? So that's what we're here to discuss. Perhaps we could quickly go around the panel and introduce ourselves. I will just pick on you in the order you come up on my screen, so bear with me. Amali, would you like to start or just say a bit about yourselves?
Very, very happy to, Volker, and a very warm welcome, everyone. Really lovely to be here. Thank you for the invite. My name's Amali de Alwis. I'm the Chief Exec of Subak, which is a new organization. It was set up to be a tech accelerator and to focus on climate change, non-for-profits. We also have a data co-op, which is obviously why sort of this theme is really important to us, and support a lot of young organizations. We're really thinking about, look, how do we use that data to make those decisions about climate change?
Great. Roelof, would you like to go next?
Sure. Lovely to be here. I'm Roelof Opperman. I'm a partner and co-head of our European office and European fund. Fifth Wall is the largest venture capital firm focused on property technology and innovation. And we actually have a climate tech fund that is specifically focused on solutions and technology within the climate world, specifically when it comes to applications within real estate.
Great, thank you, Roelof. And Gavin.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gavin Starks. I'm the founder and chief exec of Icebreaker One. We're a non-profit focused on making data work harder to deliver net zero across a number of clusters, including energy, water, transport, the built world, and agriculture. So I'm very much looking forward to our discussion today.
Gavin, I might lean a little bit onto your experience with open banking in the discussions, which I think is quite relevant to this. But let's move into the questions. So I'd like to start by perhaps reflecting on how you see the use of data in climate change today. You know, is it appropriate to the crisis that we face? Are people working with data at all scales, or are we still using spreadsheets and CSV files primarily? You know, do people understand the economic potential and the growth that could sit behind it? So at a strategic level, how do you see today the role that data plays in dealing with climate change? I'm going to mix it up a bit. So Gavin, why don't you start with this one?
Sure, I think it's a mixed bag. I think we've got a lot of momentum. There's a lot of rhetoric, but there's materiality, I think, is starting to emerge. The background on ESG reporting, so environmental, social, governance reporting, is pretty messy and subject to quite a lot of criticism, I think, and that a lot of that is quite valid. People have been working very much on spreadsheets for decades, but what we're seeing is quite a rapid and radical transformation where now everybody needs to share data and wants to share data. We're having to really get our act together across sectors, but there's a massive diversity of data maturity across organizations and across countries. So there is a mountain of work to be done ahead. And a lot of that for me is right down at the grassroots level. It's just at the plumbing level. Can we get the data in a digital format, in a shareable format? Can we make it interoperable? And can we make that interoperability cohesive across markets? At the flip end of that, you've got investors, insurers, VCs, asset managers, starting to use this information in investment decisions. So there's new standards coming to market that have been announced by the Bank of England and FCA around how the materiality of climate risk is going to be codified into the financial system. And I think we'll see some announcements in the near future this week, obviously, about the scale of investment that the financial sector is looking at bringing to the climate agenda.
Roelof, that might be a good segue to you, because you've got an interest as an investor, and you see this as a future market, but also your fund itself has got some very large sort of asset owners in the background, and where do they see, or where do you see the topic of data and climate change?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess a unique thing about our fund is probably about 60 to 70% of our assets come from big owners and operators of real estate, anywhere from CBRE to Hines to British Land. And so we get an interesting perspective. I agree it's a mixed bag across countries. We get the most, I probably have the most insight to the US and Europe. I would say Europe is definitely ahead from a legislative standpoint and from a data standpoint. I think the US is behind. But we'll see. There is quite a bit of impetus now to push ahead. I would say that it's kind of interesting because, in a way, the government is most definitely leading here. They are setting parameters. They are putting in place a lot of things that are going to have substantial teeth. But I think what's really fascinating is that there hasn't been a lot of great communication to the actual people who are going to get bitten. And so there's teeth, and then there's kind of this edge cliff, but there's not a lot of communication to them. And I think you would be shocked at, in the real estate community in general, not just our LPs, everybody, how lack of understanding I think a lot of executives have on what's about to come. And then you have a real push from, I would say, the stakeholders in real estate, tenants, and then investors. And so you have investors pushing real estate owners and operators. You have the legislative process pushing them. And so it has created this perfect storm where people do suddenly care about this. I think different organizations are in different points in terms of how their data is organized. The nice thing about real estate is there are some frameworks out there. We're not starting from scratch. But I will say that there is a mad dash. And I think as the legislation starts coming in and the teeth start biting, you are going to see a lot of people start trying to catch up. And I think that's what's really interesting now. From an investment perspective, the good thing is there are a lot of great people now starting to enter this field, particularly in sustainability data. Machine learning and AI can be tremendous tools in terms of looking at aggregations of data. And coming up with conclusions and doing things that humans just can't from a capacity standpoint. But I do think that we are behind overall. Europe's behind, the US is behind. And I do think there's going to be a lot of pain in the next probably 6 to 18 months as people kind of reconcile how to get their data together and make conclusions from it.
Hold that thought. I think we might come back to it later on the panel around what transparency might lead to amongst asset management funds and people who own, whether it's transportation or energy or water utilities. But Amali, what do you see right now? Is data a big deal in climate change today?
I think it's a huge deal. And I think going to the points that Gavin sort of mentioned earlier, we are starting to see, I think, some proper traction around here, but the market is still very sort of disaggregated. We're talking about a lot of smaller players kind of starting to come into the fold. So I think what we are seeing now is really that point where we have to start mapping this data. People have to start knowing where this data is available, who has it, what kind of information is available, because it's then that you can start doing smart things about that. And I think it's really where we start putting the data against some of our climate goals that things start really to get interesting. So for example, we have one of our member companies recently called Transition Zero, who did a bit of analysis looking at coal plants. And they basically found that if we are to hit that 1.5 degree challenge, we have to be closing something like 3,000 coal plants by 2030, right? That's one a day between now and the next 9 years. So these are the points at which the data and the reality kind of, start, the EV rubber hits the road. We have to start sort of pulling these things apart and really thinking about how that data can be helping us to make better decisions, to validate, I think, some of the policy decisions that we're making, but also where we're finding that there is a delta between the two, to really think about what solutions we can put in place to make sure that we're hitting those targets in an efficient way as well.
Let's stay on that a little bit. What are good examples that you could see in your world right now where you say, yep, here are some organizations or ideas where people are really working with data at scale in climate change today? Roelof, maybe I start with you this one. There must be something in your portfolio.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't want to pump our portfolio companies, but obviously I'm a fan of them. But there's a lot of great tools out there. We invested in a company called Clarity AI out of Madrid and New York. And what they do is use advanced machine learning and AI basically to scan fund documents, to scan assets for fund managers and asset managers, and then tap into roughly about 300 plus sustainability data sources to come up with, in a sense, a report card on sustainability. We often say in venture, you'd rather be lucky than good. We invested in this, BlackRock invested, and then the SFDR rules came out, particularly Article 8 and 9 for the EU. And suddenly greenwashing became a big issue for a lot of funds. Funds that were claiming to be sustainable suddenly had to have third-party reports and needed them quickly. So I think that this is the case where I think this is kind of a microcosm for what we're about to feel in a lot of sectors, where legislation passes, no one really sees the legislation coming, no one really communicates about it, and suddenly you wake up one day and you have to kind of prove to the world that you are a sustainable fund. And so I think that this is kind of a precursor for it. But yeah, these types of solutions are going to be very important, and we were very, really excited to help that company in the funding.
And Gavin, you do lots of work in energy right now, and one of the questions from the audience is about how might data help us lower consumption and energy use. You work with open energy with the government right now. Do you see some good examples, some good sort of use cases coming through?
Yeah, very much. And I think there's also a general trend, I think, which I haven't really felt before, of really different parts of our utility infrastructure and our public sector and our financial systems really starting to look at more systems thinking. It's quite remarkable to kind of watch this emerge as a way of thinking. So rather than protecting a sector, we need to protect systems that we're operating in. And energy is right at the heart of that. We've been working with a government-backed program called Open Energy for the last year now, about how do we open up all of the energy data across the whole of the sector. Now, there's over 9,000 companies in the UK in that sector alone. But what are the drivers to that? Well, there's a number of different drivers. One of them is just digitalization in the first place. We're moving to a more sensor-based sets of systems. But one of the big drivers is that we're creating decentralized and distributed energy production at scale. with renewables, whether that's a heat pump or a wind turbine. We're also seeing a transition to electric vehicles, which is going to radically decentralize and distribute not just the energy demand, but the energy storage. So we've got really a lot of different systems changes happening towards the transition to net zero. And we've got really ambitious targets. To hit our 2050 net zero targets, the energy sector has to do 40 to 50% of its change by 2030. And by 2030, we're also trying to phase out fossil fuel-based vehicles. So there's a huge incentive here. And as you know, we've heard already, it's not so much waking up tomorrow as and seeing that the systems are changing. They've changed. So just to link this back into the financial system, there's a group run by the FCA, Bank of England, the Climate Financial Risk Forum, who's just published its guidelines around risk management, scenario analysis, disclosure, and so on. And I think we're going to see instruments like TCFD, which is the Task Force for Climate Financial Disclosure, which is mandatory now in the UK already, really amplify. And the financial community is going to see very rapidly mandatory reporting at quite a granular scale. And that's going to force access to asset level information. Now, so if you join those two things up, you start looking at this, you have to start looking at this as a system with lots of different data suppliers and lots of different data users.
What do you think, Amali? Do you see some good examples like these coming through in your world?
Yeah, and it's been really interesting actually to hear. I think that point around, you know, the connectivity, I think, is really critical. You know, we do live in a global society, and when you think about some of those interdependencies, you know, for example, you know, thinking about the sort of the coal issue, for example, you know, we had one of our members who were looking at coal emissions, right? So Ember, they basically were part of the sort of supporters of the UK government announcing the 2035 clean power target. They recently did some work which was looking at coal emissions across assets. So actually thinking about, you know, who are the biggest polluters, for example, in the UK, right, or in Europe. And one of the things that they found was actually that Drax, which is a biomass power plant, was actually a big emitter, right? That has then had a knock-on effect because it means that a lot of funds which were basically supporting Drax as part of their portfolios have now actually decided, no, we're not going to include them in a sustainable portfolio. So that interconnectivity between open technology, thinking about the assets, and then how that links to, you know, how we support where money goes and how that is kind of, you know, taken forward to support the growth of sustainable tech. You know, all of these things are connected, and it's only really now that I think we're starting to see some of those dynamics really coming to a fold.
But this sort of brings me to the next topic quite nicely, and some of the questions that are now popping up into the chat too is at Arup, we do about 16,000 projects at any point in time, and they all thrive on data, but they're all, maybe not all, but the majority are bilateral data sharing agreements with a client, with a supplier. Actually, on our big projects, we sometimes have over 100 organizations working on a project like Crossrail or new major cities of transport infrastructure programs. So we are sharing data in quite inefficient ways right now. 60% of our cost is spent on ingestion, transformation, cleansing it, and 40% is left to actually create value, including climate change. Other industries, we found it's the other way around. 40% is done on cleansing and data infrastructure, and 60% is on value creation. And the 40% itself has become an industry where startups and companies are cleansing, making data searchable, discoverable, and then driving innovation higher up in the data value chain. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what's missing right now, because for Arup, this is just not viable for us. You know, we need to put carbon intensity, embedded carbon, operational carbon into all of our projects. And it's not going to happen if that is 60% of the cost is spent on just cleansing and ingesting. So Gavin, in the energy, and then I'd like to broaden it also to some other sectors perhaps. How many companies did you map in the open energy work with the government that are part of just that ecosystem?
Yeah, sure. It was over 9,000 organizations just in the UK related to the energy sector. So that's just on its own is a huge ecosystem. And we're drawing parallels here, I think, to the work that the Open Data Institute has done over the years, and the work we've done as well with open banking, to really try and say, how can we create not just interoperability across that system, but cohesion? And they're quite, I suppose, dull words at one level. But cohesion is basically, can we all do interoperability in a similar or identical way to reduce the friction, the cost of that data sharing in the first place? Now, that's not a technology problem. Technology is part of it. Having the right data standards and having the right descriptions, the ontologies, and so on is a component. And having open APIs is a component of that architecture. But the friction then lies in the business rules, in the legal rules, and in the culture change for organizations to say, actually, we need to be more porous as an organization. How do we enable data to flow not just inside our organization, which is also a challenge for a lot of large organizations, but outside them into other people who need access. And the number of people who are going to need access is going to grow exponentially. And it's going to include people you haven't necessarily had to share that level of information with before. And a big driver, again, I'll come back to the kind of show me the money question, is tens of trillions globally are going to be channeling towards the net zero agenda. And the question that investors will quite rightly ask is, prove it. Show me that this investment is going to deliver the environmental returns. Is it going to deliver net zero? And that's makes data political very quickly as well.
That is almost planned. I mean, that moves us right next into the next question I wanted to ask you guys. So 9,000 organizations just in the energy sector, having to sort of learn methods around data infrastructure, data institutions, data knowledge, you know, what Gavin just explained, and which open banking took a few years to really operationalize across the whole banking sector. But what are the other sectors? Because for us, energy is like this master environment in a way. You know, we need the energy data to decarbonize everything else, but it's not just energy data by itself. So it's not just the 8,000 organizations or stakeholders in energy, the relationship with property and water and city planning. So we also need to now plug energy data or carbon intensity data from energy into other sectors. How do you see the state of that? And Amali, do you see that sort of coming through in your work?
It's slow, but it is coming. And I think it's really about people starting to see how that data needs to be joined up. So for example, actually, I was having a chat with our head of data this morning, and we were talking about sort of data sets that we're looking to onboard. We were thinking about EV data. So looking at, let's say, charge points and these types of things. And then sort of, you know, I suddenly remembered that, you know, I have a friend of mine who works and owns a freight company. So he has, you know, fleets of lorries. You know, what happens when we start looking at where peak lorry usage is over the years versus the load that those lorries can carry versus the fact that we don't have larger lorries at the moment. You know, how does that work if you have smaller lorries trying to work with large retailers, you know, and you suddenly get to this point where it allows you to ask some really interesting questions around whether the tools that we think that we have at the moment can work with the goals that we have in mind, or do we need to find new tools? Now, that's pretty sort of, you know, complicated stuff, because it not only requires, I guess, all of us sitting in our silos to kind of obviously look at what data we have, but to actually start pulling on data from other sectors, you know, the sustainability sectors and the energy sectors, looking at, you know, consumer goods data and trying to think about, you know, how do the two kind of work together. So I think this is really the complexity around, I guess, bringing this data together, that it's not really just even the data around, you know, climate change. We need to look at consumption data as a whole, and that's sort of, you know, consumption, shipping, manufacturing, all of these types of things. And I think that that's still pretty early in the process, but, you know, where we can actually support companies to actually start doing those projects together to partner, I think there's a real opportunity there. And I think this is where, you know, certainly from our side, as far as supporting startups, that we really see, you know, a great gain to be made by actually supporting these young organizations who can think in that agile way and hopefully, you know, work with those partners to find those really interesting answers.
That's Roelof. That sort of brings it back to you again, isn't it? Whether I think the need is clear. You know, yeah. I think there aren't any business leaders or very few people around that say, well, maybe this climate change thing is going to go away. Right. That's just not where we are. So, and it's one of the grand challenges society is facing. Now, we just heard some very interesting ideas, but it also needs money to make change happen. Do you see this sort of capital and the tech capital coming in? Because we see climate funds growing, prop tech funds, safety tech funds, construction tech funds, you know, there's all sorts of new funds popping up. How do you see that continuing and developing?
Yeah, so maybe stepping back for 1 second, I think we think that the government's reaction to COVID is really just a precursor for what, and kind of a trial run for what's about to happen in climate change. Governments have shown what they're willing to do when they feel their population is at risk. And when climate change starts coming up, I think it's going to be the same thing. I think they're going to go very aggressive. And the way I would think about it is kind of like accounting rules or paying your taxes. You know, initially, no one collected taxes from companies, and then you had taxes. And suddenly the government doesn't really care if it's hard for you to do your taxes or if it's hard for you to do your accounting or find it. They just want to see the numbers. And I think the beauty of the numbers in this case is that it's not politicized. The numbers will tell you the truth. And so I think we're going to go through this painful period of the government's going to ask for numbers, people aren't going to have them. And then you're going to get these incredible entrepreneurs and this incredible growth in those areas to try to solve it, right? Accounting software, et cetera. We are seeing a huge amount of money come into the area. And it is principally, I would say, initially focused on digital, focused on data. And that's the good news for people on this realm. I think it's potentially bad news for humankind right now, because it's not, you know, data isn't going to solve the problem, right? It's just going to tell you how big the problem is. But I do think that that's it. I think the other thing to keep in mind is, I think what we're going to realize and governments are going to realize is that we are not paying for carbon right now, and that the best way to solve this is to use market methods. I'm kind of shocked that no one goes back to the sulfur dioxide cap and trade that the US used when we were dealing with acid rain, and how effective that was when they did that to truly price sulfur dioxide into the market. And I think once the EU rolls out more extensively the ETS or the carbon trading system that they're going to have, I think they're going to see how effective private sector moves to get the carbon down because of how expensive it's going to start becoming. And that only works if you can show the data, right? Because you're going to have to show how much carbon you used, right? Or what carbon you emitted. And so it's kind of like, whether you think it's hard, whether you think it matters or not, it's going to matter. And you're going to have to spend a huge amount of money to get your data infrastructure together from a compliance standpoint.
This, you know, you mentioned COVID. For me, what was so interesting when COVID started, my very inefficient 5-a-side football team. I mean, we're terrible footballers, but we're nice people. And we don't really talk about data. So my job, they don't care about. Chief data officer in a 5-a-side football team hasn't got a very high degree of street credit. The week before lockdown, we drew graphs on a napkin in a pub about doubling and growth rates because the individual really was interested in data. The individual really wanted to know what's going to happen next, what is going to happen in their area, what can they do themselves, what's the impact on the world they're living in. Amali, you spoke before about sort of democratizing data. Do you see this government to business issue, or is there also a role of the citizen and the consumer in this world of data and climate change?
There absolutely is. And I think the challenge will be, and I think this is where kind of the world of data hits the real world in a way, right? Which is, how do we help people to see that data and to educate themselves about how that data sort of interprets for them? And that's not actually even just consumers. I think that's government as well. You know, when we think about government decision makers, these aren't individuals who are necessarily all data scientists or data specialists. You know, how do we enable them to make sure that they have the right information at the right time to make the right decisions? It reminds me a little bit of, actually, I think there was an article in the FT probably about a month and a half ago, which was they had requested they put in a freedom of information request to look at who MPs spoke to. And they found that MPs spoke to, I guess, what would be traditionally seen as sort of more polluting industries, so the oil and gas type of sectors. They spoke to representatives from those organizations 10 times more than they spoke to climate organizations. So even as far as kind of our policymakers, you know, are they getting the right information? Do we have, you know, the right data made available to tell the right stories? And I think, you know, that very much reflects into the public sort of sectors as well, as far as, you know, from the consumer angle. They're seeing at this moment a lot of targets, a lot of promises made about, you know, we're going to, you know, remove people's, you know, being able to have new gas boilers by this date, you know, you're going to have, you know, electric cars by this date, and all of these types of things. We have to help them understand how that works for them, and where we have that difference between the reality or the cost or what people are going to do. We have to help educate around what those things really stand for, and in some cases actually to petition on their behalf to government to make sure that we have the right support in place to enable people to make those moves. And I think, you know, conversations around climate poverty, for example, will be huge issues over the coming years, and really thinking about how we support, you know, all of us to go through this journey, I think is going to become critical.
So this is a question actually we didn't discuss, but it came through the audience, that you could almost get this feeling this is a coming together of government and businesses and tech and investors, but that sounds like the classic sort of developed north, or the established industries, you know, moving forward again. But climate change is a global topic. The South, the East, everybody is in this. And what do you guys think about that? Are we having the right discussion from a genuine global perspective, and not just from the sort of European, North American? I think China's doing a lot, East Asia is doing a lot on tech and data, but are we getting towards a genuine global discussion that is representative and inclusive on this topic? Who would volunteer on that one?
No, I mean, I don't think we are. I'm not saying people aren't well-intentioned, but I do think that the challenge a little bit is the politicians are myopic to their own constituents in their country, right? And so they're going to push things that's obviously best for that country. But the world is a very diverse place. And if you think about hydrocarbons, you know, a lot of Africa still depends on hydrocarbons for keeping lights on and doing these things. And so developing nations, right, are in a very different spot than the developed world. And so I think this is what obviously they're trying to work out here at COP26 is, you know, how do you do it in a way where everyone comes together, right? Even in the UK, right, you have high taxes on electricity for renewable, low taxes on gas. And everyone says, okay, well, we should change that. But then it's like, okay, well, what about lower income people on boilers that are using gas, right? So I think this is the challenge a little bit, is that, I think we need to look at, and part of it is just the lack of data literacy and then the lack of data. And so I think that we're only going to get through this together if everyone agrees, right? It's a collective action problem, right? And we're all in this together. And by the way, it's existential. So we're only going to do this together. And I think, unfortunately, I think a lot of the pledges in the way to do it is just a lack of coming together, and then a lack of really understanding where each country is. And I think we're going to have to figure out how to narrow those gaps, right? In that case, I can give you a great example, right? Everyone's doing 250. Some people are going to go 2050. Some people are going to go, earlier. India's at 2070. So, and that's not India's fault. I mean, India's a huge country, but it just shows you the disparities on where people are right now. And I think we're going to have to figure out how to get everyone there together.
What do you think, Gavin? Where are we on the South and a more inclusive approach around this?
I think it's a mixed bag, and I think the key thing here is we're all in this together. This has to be for everyone, and so we need to embrace the principles of open, in terms of not just open access to data and open data, but open innovation and open markets. I think the scale of change here that we're trying to achieve, we must achieve. There isn't a plan B here. Is of the same scale as the Marshall Plan and the Apollo program combined. It's an investment. We spend $3.6 trillion a year on infrastructure globally. Now, there's a huge opportunity, obviously, for developing economies to just leapfrog fossil fuels and go straight to renewables. There's a huge legacy in existing more developed economies, where we've got massive legacy infrastructure in the UK. Our buildings are not fit for purpose. They all need to be retrofitted, and the cost of that is unaffordable for a very, very large number of people. So we need to fund all of that. And I think the kind of actions that individuals can take is you can ask your pension provider, or your insurer, or your bank, what are their green financing commitments? And what do they mean? And how will they prove success? And how are their CEO bonuses linked to net zero? And then link that into this global agenda, because there's no point in us getting the UK to net zero if we don't also help other countries that are struggling not increase to our previous levels. The average footprint of somebody in the UK is about 10 tons of CO2 a year. Now you can divide by 10 for developing economies and multiply by 2 for the US. So to be sustainable, we need to be under a ton per person.
So this, I have to reveal something. When you become a fellow in Arup, they hand you a crystal ball, and that predicts the future, and you can also walk across water, apparently. Hasn't yet worked for me, so I'll lean on you guys a little bit on this sort of prediction business. 2030 is tomorrow, isn't it? And the degree of change we need to achieve in existing and new infrastructure, or the existing and new built and natural world, is huge. And I think, Roelof, you mentioned that earlier, that now people still see this a little bit as real and urgent, but also abstract. Now, if we move to 2025, 27, and we're really close to some of the more meaningful targets that we have to achieve, will data at that point create a sharper edge and bring some transparency on those who have not acted, like the heavy polluters or the high emission businesses, or people who could have made change, but sitting on their portfolios or their infrastructure and just haven't acted fast or with enough intensity? Do you think at that point the game will change, and the consumer, government as a regulator, markets as investors will start to look at those who don't act and say, we now have the evidence and the data, and you haven't moved. What's going on here? There's got to be a consequence. Roelof, you're nodding. So what does your time machine tell you
I
about
mean,
2020?
I think I agree, right? I mean, I think that what's likely to happen is, so we do have, I think a lot of people are in the consensus that it's 8 years, not 27. And I think that what's likely to happen is that I think the reason people want the data and the policymakers want the data is because from the outset, global warming became a politicized issue. And the data allows you to depoliticize it. And I think that's really why politicians will push for this, because a lot of them, they may have constituents that are still doubting, but they know, and as good leaders, they know that this is the future. And so the data allows you to depoliticize the issue and just say, this is just the facts. And I think that that's going to be very helpful. And again, I do think that the governments will look for market mechanisms by which it's not that necessarily you'll have one culprit that doesn't work. It's just that culprit will go bankrupt because they can't pay the fines, right? And they can't pay the extra carbon trading, in a sense, taxes that comes through to it. And I think that's kind of what will happen, is that the government will step in that particular way. Consumers are already stepping in, and that's where the pressure is coming from, right? I mean, that's why the pensions are pressuring. That's why the tenants are pressuring. It's coming from the consumers. But I think
so. We saw this with COVID. Data is political, and data on the big topics always has been, whether it was education or whether it was healthcare. And I guess with climate data, it will become more political too.
I'd really like to amplify that point, because we're going to see trillions of dollars, tens of trillions of dollars flowing into this ecosystem. Now, a lot of companies are not going to want to share, and what they do share will tell a different story. It'll tell the story they want to be told. So data can be used, while it can be used to depoliticize issues, I think we know very well that data can also be used to politicize issues and to take us down different paths than we might wish. I think that, so while we've spoken, I think, about a lot of positives on our session today, we've got to be incredibly sharp on which data, from which sources, how can we trust it? What's the trust framework we're going to put around this?
Yeah,
so that question of provenance and understanding the true intent and where it's coming from is going to get big, isn't it? I mean, so Amali, I cut you off. I didn't mean to do that.
No, I was just going to echo that point that, I'm as a former quant researcher, it's always interesting that, you can make the data tell many stories, and you only have to look even as far as, let's say, the accounting industry, which, one could argue is one which has been, numerical from the start, and yet the stories that we tell from them, how that is used, can be subverted in a lot of different ways. And this is where we need to be careful. And this is where I think, for any organization working in this area, working in a bipartisan way, such a critical way as well, because we have to avoid this becoming a political wagon where, one party decides, yes, it wants to support and one hasn't. And, one could argue that in the US, we've seen this to some extent, in the UK, I think, one of our politicians who what was it, the quote, the world has had enough of experts, so this is a real risk to us. There is potential for a great deal of backlash around this. And I really do think that, all of us working in these sectors have to, be on the front foot, to go and have those conversations, to have those difficult conversations with people who are going to be challenged by this, and to help them understand where we're coming from, but also to listen to what their problems are, so that we can create sort of systems, platforms, processes in a better way where these can be considerate of people who are going to be challenged by this as well.
I guess in this topic, the consequence of not acting are going to be visible to everybody. The South is seeing it now. The floods we saw back home in Germany, the weather events that are happening more frequently.
It is, Volker, but it's, and I kind of bring the analogy of it's boiling frogs, right? And I don't know if you've heard that analogy before, when certain things are happening, and we've seen through COVID that we are as a world capable of making change fast, right? But what happens when things are rising slowly. You know, we're talking about, 1.5 degrees, for a lot of people, they're looking at those numbers and going, oh, but that's not much. Surely that's not going to be a big impact. And yet this is literally sort of, at a point where this could be a world destroying event. So I think, we do need to, think about how we instill that sense of urgency around something which is happening very slowly, and yet, we'll get to a tipping point, and some would say we're already there. So
isn't that where data can help, by making the invisible visible, creating actionable insights, making better investment decisions?
I think here the key mantra is connect, don't collect. There's a huge emphasis on trying to gather all the data to gain a market advantage. And actually, as we move into these systems models, as we move into more of a digital twin type of modeling environment, we have to get the data connected to all the other data. Through that, we will also be able to address radical transparency and call people out who are telling different stories with the same data. So openness is at the heart of the future here if we really want to hit net zero.
Right, guys, are being flagged now. The time counters are counting down against us. Roelof, I'll give you the last word, and then I just try to wrap up with a comment at the end.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that transparency is an option now. It's not going to be in the future, and we're kind of at the Noah's Ark moment, right? And I think that's I think data is going to help us in the future. But to me, you can either get your house in order now, or you can do it at gunpoint in a few years from the government. So
on that note, thank you very much for joining us. We are at the end of this panel session. I'd like to point everybody in the audience or participated. We're publishing a call for collaboration called Tackling the Climate Crisis with Data, which you can find on the ODI website, on the Arup website, on social media. And it's an open call for people to comment on some ideas and suggestions that our research teams have put together. It's not the final view, but we'd like to hear from as many people as possible on what can we do with data in dealing with climate change. So thank you very much, everybody, and back to Naga and the Open Data Summit. Thank you.